Okay, and hello, and welcome to the second lesson on Unit 1 on our unification of Germany. Today what we're going to look at is what were the three political outlooks in the 1840s. We're going to look at three key areas today. We're going to explain what is meant by reactionary policy, we're going to explain what is meant by liberalism, and we're going to explain what is meant by nationalism. The key words for these topics will be reactionary policy, liberalism, and nationalism. So let's get started. What was reactionary policy? Reactionary policy is a policy adopted by governments who want to prevent any radical change. It was very popular in Europe after 1815. So what does this mean? Well, reactionary policy was adopted by governments when they actively wanted to stop any reform. Specifically, reform for ordinary people to have more of a voice or more say in what happened in the country. The reason they wanted to do this is that after the invasion of Napoleon in the early 1800s, they didn't want to risk losing their power again. They'd regained their power in 1815 and they wanted to keep hold of it. Reactionary policy was a shared view of both Frederick William III and the First Minister of Austria, Prince Metternich. Now, Prince Metternich is a very important person. He is seen as the father of reactionary policy. He was a well-respected politician at the time, and it was him who came up with this idea that any kind of reform should be stopped. They both believed that monarchs and aristocrats should rule state, and that middle and lower classes should not concern themselves with such matter. They believed it was up to them and the other rich, powerful people in their country to decide how the country is run. They didn't believe that the middle classes or lower classes had any role within the running of a country. Therefore, despite their rivalry, both leaders worked together in securing the positions of autocratic rulers and stopping any reform. So here we see a rare instance of Prussia and Austria working together for the same political aim. One key thing they did to achieve this was by the passing of the Carlsbad Decrees in 1819. So, what were the Carlsbad Decrees of 1819? Passed in 1819, the Carlsbad Decrees were a reactionary piece of politics that aimed to stop reform and radical thinking in the German Confederation. So we can see here that this fits in perfectly with the reactionary policy we've just talked about. Okay, so its aims are to stop reform and any radical thinking, so thinking or speech that might change what people think. They were originally created after the murder of August von Kotzebue, a German writer, by a liberal student who disagreed with his views. Now we're going to come to this term liberal in a bit, but let's just talk about the rest of this. So August von Kotzebue was a famous German writer. He was very supportive of the monarchy, so the kings, and the way that the German states were run. This liberal student disagreed with this point of view, and he actually murdered August to try and prove his point. This meant that the governments of Austria and Prussia had a perfect excuse to pass the law that they were going to pass. This is something they'd wanted to pass for a while, but this event allowed them to do that. So the decrees put in a series of restrictions on university life and the freedom of press. Now, the freedom of press is a really important issue. The freedom of press allows for newspapers at this time to criticise the government. They don't have to just be complimentary. They can criticise. They can say, I don't agree with this. We don't agree with what you've done here. They can put forward other political views. For example, they might say that they believe that the people should have more say in the laws that are made in a country. That might be something that their newspaper actively promotes. Now, this is going to be a problem for reactionary rulers. They don't want these sort of things being discussed. So the Carlsbad Decrees put an end to this. The Carlsbad Decrees also put serious restrictions on university life. A couple of examples of this. They banned any secret societies within a university. So any society that discussed ideas that were outside of this reactionary policy view and the idea that the government should be controlled by the monarch and the top aristocrats was banned. If you were caught in this, you would be expelled. Another part of this was that if you were expelled from one university for your views, you couldn't join another university. So if you were banned from the University of Berlin, you couldn't move to the University of Cologne. This achieved two things. One, it alienated that person from education, and two, it stopped these ideas from spreading further. If we think about this logically, if someone has spread the ideas at Berlin and is then able to go to the University of Cologne, they're going to spread the same ideas there, and therefore there is going to be more people that might buy into that idea. So these are just two examples of how the Carlsbad Decrees of 1819 actively stopped any reform from happening. The real key part for the Carlsbad Decrees is it really highlights Prussia and Austria working together. And this is something that, while rare, did happen. Though they were rivals for who was going to have complete power, they would work together when it truly benefited them. Here we see a cartoon created about the Carlsbad Decrees. Now this was created by an underground liberal group. Again, we're going to come on to liberals in a minute. And what it shows is a group of men discussing political ideas. The problem is, as we can see from the picture, they've all been gagged, so that nobody can hear what they're trying to say, and they can't say it. And this is exactly what the Carlsbad Decrees aimed to do. They aimed to stop the discussion of political ideas that didn't agree with those of the monarch and the aristocrats. So we've mentioned this word a few times. So what is it? What was liberalism? Well, liberalism is the idea that protecting and enhancing the freedom of the individual should be central to politics. So this is the idea that people should have the freedom to do what they want. They should have the freedom to say what they want. They should have the freedom to do what they want, as long as it is within the laws of criminality. If somebody wants to lose all their money, they can. If somebody wants to say that the king is rubbish, they can. They believe that this idea should be at the core of all politics. And liberalism at the time was really into enhancing this, enabling people to have that freedom and protecting what freedoms they did have. The reason this became a bigger idea is that the political world had been changed. There were two major events in the 1700s: the creation of the United States and the French Revolution. Both of these events had a big impact in the spreading of liberal ideas. For example, the formation of the United States removed the King of England as the ruler of that area. Instead, it put in place an elected government. That elected government also had to abide by the Constitution. Now, you've probably heard people talking about the United States Constitution. And in it are many rules that people had to follow, and that the government had to respect. For example, the freedom of speech is protected by the Constitution. The government cannot actively stop people from saying what they want. The government can't treat people differently because they've said what they want. And this is something that people wanted to see in Europe. They wanted that ability to discuss what they wanted. They wanted the ability to vote for who was in control. The second major event that impacted this politics in Europe was much closer to home, and this was the French Revolution. In the French Revolution, we see the working class rise up against the upper classes, the monarchs, the aristocrats, and remove them from power. The King of France is actually executed, and the people take control and declare France a republic. This gives the average person much more freedom and takes the power out of the sole hands of the elites. Both these events had challenged the idea that God gave monarchs the right to rule. The US had removed the King of England as their ruler. The French had killed their king. And this put more power into the hands of the people of those countries. The invasion of Germany by France during the Napoleonic Wars helped to spread these liberal ideals. The French invaded Germany and they controlled the area for a number of years. And this meant that these ideas of liberalism were discussed by French soldiers and local Germans, educated Germans in universities, and these ideas started to spread. So by the time that the German powers regained control in 1815, after the Congress of Vienna, these ideas have become semi-adopted into German politics, especially by those radicals who wanted to see change. This led to the idea of freedom of speech and elections being discussed by universities and by university students. And these are the people who are going to be influential in the future. So this was a big problem to the reactionary governments. Karl Marx, who eventually goes on to form the Communist Party, was living in Germany at this time. And he split the political views in Germany really into two main categories. One category he called the Party of Movement. These were people who wanted to see a movement in the current laws, a change. These people were liberals. They wanted people to have more freedoms. They wanted the king to have less power. And this was really important. Okay? And this is what they were aiming to do. On the other side, we had the Party of the Resistance. These were reactionary rulers. Okay? These were the people who wanted things to stay the same. They didn't want to see this change. They wanted the power to stay with the monarch and the aristocrats. So what did liberals want? We've already discussed some points, but let's have a look in some greater depth. The term liberal is a very broad one, and the extent of change that liberals wanted differed. Some wanted to see a constitutional monarchy, while others wanted universal suffrage. So what does that mean? Constitutional monarchy is what we have in this country. It is where a monarch or a king or queen stays in place, but they are limited by a series of rules. We looked at this to an extent in our GCSE course with the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was the list of rules the barons wanted King John to agree to. And these rules put restrictions on what he could do. For example, he could no longer lock a baron up without a trial. He had to allow barons to keep their land unless there was a genuine reason. He couldn't just take it away. And some people wanted to see this in Germany. They wanted to keep their current rulers, but they wanted their power to be limited. Others, at the other end of the spectrum, wanted to see much more radical reform, with universal suffrage introduced. Universal suffrage is the idea that a government is chosen by votes, and the universal part means that everybody gets to vote. So this is the idea that everybody would vote in who runs the country. And the importance of votes is not necessarily choosing who you want, but it's that ability to remove somebody who has done the wrong things, who you don't agree with. And currently, monarchs couldn't be removed this way. So if there was a bad monarch, the people were stuck with them. What can be agreed by all liberals was that they wanted to fight to remove the restrictions of the Carlsbad Decrees. They wanted to have the freedom of speech to discuss these ideas, to produce newspapers that looked at politics from their point of view. There were some gains made by liberals before the 1840s. So before our course starts in 1840s, there had been some progress by liberals. An example of these was in the 1830s, some states made their constitutions more liberal. These included Brunswick and Saxony. In 1833, Hanover gained its first constitution from its ruler. So here we see the constitutions, or the rules that limited what governments and kings could do, becoming more liberal or being introduced for the first time. And this was a big step forward for liberals. There are some more gains the liberals make during the 1840s, but I think it's important to highlight here that liberal gains were already being made before our course starts. So this isn't something new that starts in 1840. This is something that has been bubbling over in Europe since the War of Independence in America, since the French Revolution. Okay, now that brings us on to our final point, and that is nationalism. So, while reactionary policy and liberalism were kind of opposite ends of the political spectrum, nationalism kind of sits on its own to the side. You could have somebody who supports reactionary policy who also wanted to see nationalism. At the same time, you can have liberals who also wanted to see nationalism. So nationalism wasn't specific to either liberals or to reactionary policy. In a way, it was more liberal as it saw some major reform. But there were reactionary policy people who maybe supported the King of Prussia who wanted to see a country nationalized or unified under that ruler. So what is nationalism? This is the idea that a large group of people who share the same culture, language, history and much more form a separate individual nation of their own. So let's discuss that in a bit more detail. These 39 German states cover a large area, But what is interesting is not how they are different, but how they are the same. For example, the language spoken in Prussia was the same as that in Bavaria. On top of that, the culture is very similar. If we think about typical German culture of beer halls and lederhosen, this would have been seen in Berlin and it would have been seen in Munich. So these people shared a similar identity. One of the biggest similarities actually comes from their shared history. Both these areas had been part of the Holy Roman Empire. Both had recently been invaded by France and had fought them back. It was this identity that brought people together. And there were some people in Germany who wanted to see these states come together and be united under one flag, to be united as Germany. Now this is going to be one of the key issues we look at throughout our course. The course is about unification. It's about how these states came together. In the 1840s, this was not widespread. This idea was in its infancy. It was just starting out. And people still needed to be sure exactly what it would mean for them. How much of their identity would they lose? How much would a Prussian person lose if they became German? So this idea will spread throughout this course, okay? And it will get stronger for some and weaker for others. So what main points do I want you to take from today? Well, firstly, I want you to take the point of reactionary policy. This idea that leaders, kings and aristocrats wanted to keep control for them, and they actively stopped any reform from happening. They silenced members of opposition groups so the ideas of different to theirs could not spread. Liberalism. The idea of putting the people at the centre of politics and giving them freedoms that are protected, the right to say what they want, to write what they want, to express their ideas, to have a say in the political system. And finally, nationalism. This idea that many states in Germany had this shared identity and that they should be brought together to create one stronger country, or Germany. So I want to say thank you for listening to this. Make sure you make some good notes on what each of these are, as they're going to come up multiple times throughout our course. If you need further explanation, please come and see me and we can discuss it further. Thank you.